Hello everyone. If you've been reading my community posts, you'll know that I've been having a hard time figuring out how to continue this series that I just started. So in order to keep putting that off, I've decided that it's time to talk about constructed languages again. In this video, I intend to give a brief, opinionated, surface-level overview of the International Auxiliary Language of Globasa, which was launched in 2019 by Hector Ortega. This video should not be taken as a super authoritative presentation of the language, it's more just my first impressions, and the presentation might be a little scatterbrained. Perhaps someday I'll make a more proper video. I'm a bit excited because this video is a first in a few ways. It's the first episode that was requested, thank you TesXTrio1728, it's the first episode about a language that isn't notable enough to have a Wikipedia article, and it's the first episode on a conlang I do not speak. That means I have an excuse to not be as in-depth as I was in my previous videos, although I still apologize if I get facts wrong. You may recall that in one of my previous videos, I talked about how most newer international auxiliary languages don't really attract my attention because they lack history, a large body of speakers, and because they're all generally pretty samey. Globasa fits in pretty well with those newer auxlangs, but it stands out a little bit to me since it's one of the few that I've found enthusiasm for without actively looking for it. Also, the guy that created it commented on one of my videos, which is cool, I suppose. Throughout the video, I will compare Globasa with Esperanto, since it's what I know, and for better or worse, it's kind of a measuring stick for IALs. I will start by discussing the phonology. Even though I went in knowing that Globasa had quite a few similarities to Esperanto, I was surprised to find that the consonant inventories are nearly identical. I've put both of them up on screen for your convenience. You'll notice that the only real difference is that Globasa gets rid of ts, zh, and h. That being said, there are a few subtler differences. For one thing, the ideal pronunciation of the voiceless plosives is aspirated for the benefit of speakers of languages that make an aspiration distinction, rather than a voiceless one, which I think is a good call. Globasa makes similar allowances for some of the fricatives. That being said, some of the complications of Esperanto remain. I know that, for monolingual native Spanish speakers at least, the b-v distinctions and the ch-j-sh distinctions may pose some initial difficulty. Unlike Esperanto, however, which is pretty happy to make use of these distinctions, Globasa's word selection criteria makes the good call of recommending avoiding minimal pairs whenever possible. Something I think might be a bit of a regression is the way stress works in the language. In Esperanto, the stress always goes in the penultimate syllable. Now, maybe this isn't the best place to put the stress, there's a good argument that maybe it should have gone at the end, but the point is that it's always in the same place. In Globasa, however, the location of stress depends on whether or not the word ends with a vowel or a consonant. If the word ends in a consonant, then the stress goes at the end, but if it doesn't, then it goes on the second to last vowel, to use the documentation's wording. I'm not sure what the rationale for this was, and it seems like it'd be a stumbling block at first. Oh, and the vowels are basically just a 5-vowel system, whatever. Onto the vocabulary. So, when people discuss proposals for international auxiliary languages, the discussion often turns to whether or not the vocabulary is Eurocentric. I already explained why I think Eurocentric vocabularies, while perhaps not ideal, are not necessarily a bad move depending on what your priorities are when designing an auxlang. However, Globasa does make an explicit commitment to representing a diverse share of languages from all over the world, not just Europe, although it seeks a balance between this and having roots that will be recognizable by large amounts of people. So, does it succeed? Well, personally I think Globasa does a good enough job, but I still think there's room for some critique. Globasa boasts that it sources its vocabulary primarily from 16 major world languages, which I'll just list on screen. I think it's a decent selection, but it should still be pointed out that there's something of a European bias, with the top 5 most represented languages being mostly European, and the 5 least represented languages being from Africa or Asia. So what we have here is a language that still has a bit of a European bias, but without the thing that justifies European bias, which is having a language whose words are almost all already recognizable to someone who speaks one. I do think Globasa's vocabulary has many good ideas. One of them is the use of onomatopoeia. For example, the word for laugh is jaja, the word for cry is wawa, the word for sing is lala, and the word for cattle is mumu. Something else I think is interesting is that they deliberately went out of their way to give the words for banana and flower the slight. Like Esperanto, Globasa has a collection of table words that tackle things like demonstratives or question words like who or when. Unlike Esperanto, however, Globasa forms these words by using pre-existing words, rather than Esperanto, which just sort of lets table words be their own thing. Speaking of forming words, derivational system. I've already talked about how Esperanto's derivational system is in my view one of the best things about it, so if Globasa has it beat, then I'm in a bit of trouble. Globasa claims that with just 500 roots, you can recognize 90% of the vocabulary, and like in Esperanto, this is made possible by an agglutinative system with an assortment of affixes, some of which seem to be transparently from Esperanto, that can be combined freely with any root. I've even heard that Globasa makes greater use of its word-building system than Esperanto, and I see that Globasa's criteria for new words is more strict on making sure compounding isn't an option, as opposed to Esperanto's more, let's just say, permissive criteria. Does this mean that it's Zamenhof for Esperanto? Well, in order to make a truly informed decision, I'd have to learn Globasa and use its word-building system. There is a potential pitfall that I can see Globasa falling into, which is higher dependence on lexicalization, making the word-building system less spontaneously usable. But maybe it's not a problem in practice, so I will hold my judgment. There is at least one aspect where I'm confident Esperanto's system still comes out on top, if not in the being good for an IAL department, then at least in the being something I personally find fun department, which will take us nicely into the grammar. Unlike Esperanto, Globasa does not have markings for the part of speech that a word takes. This is in line with the language's goals. The website explicitly explains that they got rid of this feature because Globasa is meant to be like a Creole language, and the part of speech endings are definitely not something you'd find in one. It's not a bad call, it's just something I personally don't think is very fun. Now, since these part of speech endings in Esperanto often play a grammatical role, not necessarily a derivational one, Globasa has to compensate for not having them somehow. For distinguishing between nouns and adjectives, it uses word order. Adjectives come before the noun. I'm personally not a big fan of the loss of free word order. For the different tenses and moods, Globasa introduces a family of particles that roughly correspond with the verb endings in Esperanto. Using these particles is optional, which is good, but not using any particles on a verb may be interpreted as expressing the simple present, which I'm not sure how to feel about, as it makes tense marking feel less optional. And other than making tense and mood optional, I don't really see how this is better than suffixing. It's basically just the same system, except it might take longer to say things. I'm also not sure how I feel about the past tense particle being le, since it's from Chinese, but in Chinese, le is more of an aspect particle than a tense particle. Globasa gets rid of the participles that Esperanto has, but it still has a passive and compound tenses, which it expresses by the use of a passive prefix and combining tense particles respectively. You'll notice that this sometimes leads to reduplication, which I guess is funny. There's also more aspect markers in Globasa than in Esperanto, which I guess is fine, but I don't really see why the aspect system needs to be made more complicated. So to wrap up my thoughts so far on Globasa, it seems like a pretty respectable IAL attempt. Will it replace Esperanto for me? Probably not. The main thing I'd have to look into is the word building system. Globasa's flag does kinda mog though. I think that's all I have to say for now. On the whole, I'd say I like Globasa more than I like Tokipona, but not as much as Esperanto, making it the second best language reviewed so far. Thanks for watching and join me next time where I'll be looking at Kotava.